Alright, cameras on. My name is Michael Tyler Slosher. You might know me as Michael. I do go by Tyler. It's a long story. You don't have to worry about it. Today I'm doing my information presentation assignment. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to include the specific purpose in the assignment, so I just will anyway. The purpose of this presentation is to allow the audience to understand what Chaim Perelman and his translator, Henry W. Johnstone Jr., describes in the work Rhetoric and Philosophy, as well as the conclusion the author reaches. After that, I suppose we'll just jump right on into the presentation, starting with the thesis statement. The purpose of Perelman's article, Rhetoric and Philosophy, is to dissect the purposes, merits, and obstacles involved in both philosophic and rhetorical discourse, the culmination of which being that philosophical discourse strives to convince audience of one universal truth by the virtue of it being undeniable and universal truth, while rhetorical discourse seeks to convince the audience of any truth by modifying their methods of speech to suit the situation and convince a specific audience. Now let me ask you, which is the truly correct method of speaking? Should you speak differently in order to convince different audiences of the same truth, or should you speak the same truth in order to convince all audiences? This is essentially the difference between philosophic and rhetorical speaking. One seeks to find a logical way to make their statement undeniably true, while the other tailors their argument to convince their audience of the truth based on appealing to the specific audience. In the article, Rhetoric and Philosophy, in 1968, the very first article, translated by Henry W. Johnstone Jr. in the now well-established Philosophy and Rhetoric Journal, Chaim Perelman examined both methods of discourse. Throughout the article, Perelman discusses the history of both, ranging from Greco-Roman history, the effect of Christianity in both evolutions, and more. The article focuses on pitting the two discourse methods against each other in various examinations, showing the superiority of one over the other in one regard, and its inferiority in another, as well as how those positions shifted over time. To begin, let's discuss one of the ideas that Perelman used to explain the controversy of rhetorical versus philosophical discourse. When using Greco-Roman history as a setting for the discussion over the qualifications for a good leader, Perelman asks, is it to the good speaker or to the accomplished dialectician that one ought to trust with political affairs? Perelman, 1968, page 15. The purpose of this analogy is to beg the question of which is the more reliable method of speaking, rhetorical or philosophical. The good speaker in this analogy is representative of the rhetorical approach, one who is able to persuade a large amount of people, while the accomplished dialectician is representative of the philosophical approach, one who is supposedly definitively correct and more knowledgeable. And one moment, please. Here I have with me a bullhorn. This bullhorn is much like rhetorical speaking in an analogous sort of way. The purpose of rhetorical speaking is to specifically adapt your speech in order to persuade your audience, or in other words, amplify your persuasive ability, much like a bullhorn allows you to amplify your voice and be heard by a greater number of people. This is opposed to having a foolproof philosophy where by virtue of being correct and on the side of truth, you are more persuasive. However, less people may understand or appreciate perspective, much like speaking with a regular tone of voice. Perelman also discusses the dichotomy of the active lifestyle and the contemplative lifestyle. Perelman explains that the active lifestyle is the method used by those who wish to inspire people and use their powers of persuasion in order to accomplish tangible goals. These men should be able to argue any point, regardless of correctness, in order to persuade others to their side, making them correct by virtue of being the last man standing in the proverbial ring. The contemplative lifestyle, on the other hand, is to comprehend the truth of the universe and use that truth as a guide for their daily lives. The core logic behind this being that by extrapolating their plans, speeches, and actions from the truth of the universe, all of their actions and thoughts would be in turn true or correct. In regard to how each approach dealt with convincing audiences, Perelman spoke about how there was one primary way each method enacted. Philosophical discourse claimed victory through the logic that because their reasoning came through self-evident truth, then all logical extension of that truth was utterly true, with no room for argument. This meant that if two people disagreed, one was simply logically incorrect, and one side could simply not see the rational thread that connected the correct answer in the argument to the universal self-evident truth. Rhetorical discourse was only able to counter this by virtue of not being self-evident. In one culture, universal truth commonly came from religious beliefs, such as Christians believing in God, His plan, and subsequently the dictations of the church. However, a completely separate culture might have beliefs that made it so those truths are not so self-evident, as those truths that are self-evident to Christians would no longer be self-evident, making the argument of universal truth suddenly invalid, and once again, rhetoric could be used to explain the divide. In the end, Perelman finds rhetorical and philosophical discourse to be two sides of the same coin. Rhetorical discourse, at its heart, is about convincing the audience of the truth by any means necessary, regardless of whether the truth they preach is truly true. In contrast, philosophical discourse is centered around identifying the truth of the universe and using that to prove the correct answer to any problem, granting them persuasion via complete correctness. By combining both approaches, one is able to break down rhetoric to its core forms via philosophic analysis, and then use enhanced persuasive ability of rhetoric to explain the complex systems of philosophic discourse with increased persuasive power. Perelman finds you can be smart, or you can be charismatic. Or even better, you can be both. And that's about all I have. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day / night, or wherever you live, and whatever time it is.